This is part 2 of Unit 3. We were, again, remember talking about the Constitution. And when we last left off, we were talking about the Constitutional Convention, how these 55 men from most of the states were meeting to fix the Articles of Confederation, but decided to, instead of fixing it, create a new government from scratch. And we said that these were some of the brightest minds in the country. It was led by James Madison, who's called the father of the Constitution because so many of his ideas are in there. Now, I didn't mean to give you the impression that everything was hunky-dory. There was some discussion and argument at the Constitutional Convention, and that's where we're going to start today. There was a lot of disagreements about some of the things, about writing this new government. And that's why the Constitution sometimes is called a bundle of compromises. Compromise meaning you give and take. I don't get everything I want, but I get some of it and you get some of what you want. And so they had to compromise an awful lot in order to write this. And that's simply because they had people from all walks of life there, and they had different views of the world. And so they each had different things that were important to them that they had to work through. So let's just go through some of those. The first one is going to be, how are we going to have representation in the new government? Okay? We're going to have a republic. We talked about that in the first part of the lecture. We're going to hire people to do our voting and do our government work for us. But how are we going to decide how many each state gets? Is it going to be based on population, which is what the Virginia plan is? The Virginians said, hey, the more people that your state has, the more representatives you should have. That's only fair, that's only logical. Those people are paying more taxes. They should have more say. They have more people. Okay? But then you had small states like New Jersey basically saying, no, that's no good for us because we're going to be totally powerless in the new government. The big states are going to do whatever they want because they have more people. Be like, if you take a look today, North Dakota has 1 member in the House of Representatives where California has over 50. You can see why some of the small states were like, hey, this isn't going to be fair because we're going to be totally outvoted. So the New Jersey plan was put forth by the small states where they basically said each state should have the same number of representatives. Like senators, North Dakota has 2, California has 2. That's the New Jersey plan. And of course, that's good for the small states, but then again, the big states are like, well, that's not fair to us. We shouldn't be punished just because we have a big population. The more people, the more representatives you have. That's just common sense. And so what they ended up doing is compromising, put forth by the delegates from Connecticut. It's called the Connecticut Compromise, or most often it's called the Great Compromise, which is what they ultimately settled on, which is what we have today, where we have representation in a bicameral legislature. We have a legislative branch that has 2 parts. The House of Representatives is going to be based on population. The more people you have, the more representatives you have there, like I said with North Dakota and California. But then you have the Senate, where each state has the same, like I said earlier as well. So that's the Great Compromise, where you have the bicameral legislature, and no bill, no law can be passed unless it goes through both of them. So it was a way to give the small states a feeling of security that, hey, we are going to have some stake in this, we're going to have some voice, because we can stop it in the Senate if we don't like a bill. But it also gave the larger states like New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, something they wanted, because they're going to have a bigger voice. And the biggest thing is the House of Representatives has more say in bills about money, how money is spent and collected. So that's why they have more in the House of Representatives than in the Senate. But that's the first kind of compromise. Another one is going to be over the issue of slavery. Now, we talked about this a little bit before. Slavery is going to be kind of avoided. Okay, and my question to you would be why? Why do we want to did these guys maybe not want to bring up slavery a whole lot? If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If we bring up slavery and we try to eliminate it, what's the southern states probably going to do at this convention? They're going to leave. They need slavery. Slavery is the backbone of their economy. It's what makes life in the South possible. You can't have the plantations, you can't do all that work without the labor. So they need slavery. So there was a lot of people at the convention, and a lot of people, or at least a growing number of people in the North, that wanted to tackle slavery, thought it was wrong and we should get rid of it once and for all. But basically what they ended up doing is, we're going to table slavery right now. The most important thing is to get a government that in place that will keep our country going, and we'll tackle slavery at another time. That was kind of their thinking. So slavery was fairly avoided, but those Southerners said, slaves are people, we should count them as part of our population. We should get, representatives based on that. We have to represent them too. And of course the Northerners are like, what do you mean? You don't treat them like people any other times. Why do you want to treat them now as people? And of course there's an argument ensued, and basically they come up with the 3/5 compromise. They're not going to count all the slaves as they total up a state's population, but they're going to count 3/5 of them. Okay, 3/5 of them. So you don't get to count all your slaves when you figure out your representatives. You get to count 3/5 of them. And why they came up with that fraction is, I suppose it's because it's halfway, or it's in between 50% and 75%. I'm sure that's kind of how it got there, but I don't know for sure. The main point here that I want to make is that basically the Constitution makes slavery legal. It does not outlaw it, and so in essence it guarantees that slavery is going to continue and be legal. Only thing that happens is, that's not going to change till after the Civil War. The only thing that does change slowly is that they're going to say slavery cannot spread as much, or you can't buy and sell slaves in the government. The third other problem is, how are we going to decide who our leader is? How are we going to select a president? That's where they disagreed a lot as well. So their solution was this complicated process known as the Electoral College. You probably know that when people vote, like we will this November, your vote doesn't actually decide who's president. What your vote does is tell some people called the Electoral College how to vote. And they actually vote, and that usually takes place in December of every election year. And basically it's a complicated system where each state has so many electors, and that's based on population. And the electors are equal to your total number of people that you have in the legislative branch. So North Dakota has 3 electoral votes because we have 2 senators and 1 congressman. California has like 54 because they have, I think, 52 representatives and then and then 2 senators to get to 54. The reason that they did this is, again, they didn't trust the common people's vote. So they wanted to put in the hands of these electors who were supposed to be like these really great, wonderful people who would never do anything wrong and were very enlightened people. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that if the Electoral College, if you didn't get enough votes in the Electoral College to declare a winner, then the House of Representatives gets to decide, which in actuality is what they thought would happen most of the time. Hasn't happened that way in our history, but when they wrote this, they kind of thought most of the time it's going to be the House of Representatives who selects the president, not these Electoral College people. But most of the time it has done just the opposite. But they just didn't trust the people. They also, I guess I'm trying to spit it out here, they also wanted to make sure the president was independent enough so he didn't have to be such a brown-noser to get everybody's votes. If you kind of have this in-between party, then you can have a president who's free to speak his mind and do what he thinks is best for the country without having to be too much of a politician, I guess, that he has to go around and do favors for everybody to get their vote. So that's kind of their thinking. These are the 3 great compromises of the Constitution, but it just shows you that not everything was kind of rosy. There were some things they had to work through, but they did work through them, and there were some big disagreements, and they did figure a way around them, which is pretty telling of how important these people thought the Constitution was. Now that the Constitution is written, we have to get it approved, which is what ratification means. It means a document has to be approved or accepted, and it had to be ratified by the states. You had to get 9 out of the 13, I believe it was, to accept this before the new government would replace the Articles of Confederation. So that process then began after the Constitution was written. As I just mentioned a second ago, you needed 9 states to accept it for it to be official. Quickly, 2 groups emerged. People that are for the Constitution are called Federalists. These are people like Madison, Alexander Hamilton. These are people that think it's a good thing. They're pushing for it. Okay? These, again, are the 2 most important guys, Hamilton and Madison. They're at the forefront. There's a series of paper called the Federalist Papers, which is these 2 gentlemen and another guy named John Jay, who wrote a few of them. They're just arguments for why we should accept the Constitution. Don't be afraid of it. It's a good thing. It's not going to be too powerful. It's what our country needs. They're called the Federalist Papers. They were published in papers throughout the states, and it was just articles by these guys trying to convince people that we should side with ratification and we should approve that. The other group is easy to remember because they're the anti-federalists. These are people that are opposed to the new Constitution. They don't like it. They think it's a mistake. It's too much power to the government, so on and so forth. Some big names here. Sam Adams, Patrick Henry mentioned a little bit ago, John Hancock. Those are guys that were pretty big for the Revolution. They see the new Constitution as a backward step. We're going away from what we fought the Revolution for. It's giving too much power to the government, and that has shown us in history that that's abuse waiting to happen. We don't want to give a lot of power to the national government. Okay? They really want to see the states continue to have most of the power instead of the national government. And they're in particular afraid of one part of the new government called the Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes nicknamed the Elastic Clause. This is something that they put into the new Constitution that said Congress has the power to do anything necessary and proper for the good of the country. And these guys said, how do you determine what's necessary and proper? You could basically argue that anything is necessary and proper. It gives them too much. It's like a blank check. You could do whatever you wanted. And they had a real issue with that part of it. And that's why it's called the Elastic Clause, because you can stretch it to kind of fit whatever you want. Because basically, if you think about it, you could really justify anything that being necessary and proper. So these people were really against the Constitution. They lobbied for it not to be ratified. And it's mainly because they thought that the government was too powerful and it was going to take power away from the states. As you, I hope, know, the Federalists end up winning. But the Anti-Federalists did get one important part of the Constitution added, the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And you guys know the freedom of speech, freedom of press, the right to bear arms, rights of the accused, like the Fifth Amendment and things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about these specifically in class. But remember, most of the state governments had already included bills of rights. And they thought that that was essential to guard their liberty. Madison, who you know is the father of the Constitution, said it's not needed. There's enough other things in here, so if the government starts to take away your rights, we have ways to correct that. But the Anti-Federalists were pretty insistent that we need these things actually written down so we know what's guaranteed, what's not, what the government can do and cannot do. Put it on paper, it makes it more binding. And basically, what ended up happening is the Federalists agreed, okay, we'll put in a Bill of Rights, and that's what ended up getting enough votes for ratification. And that's kind of what pushed it over the top and convinced people that it was enough of a guarantee that we could trust this new government not to abuse us. So, the new government's in place. It's going to be accepted. We're going to talk about, as you can see on the board here, the first presidents then that took power under that government and some of the things that they did or some of the things that happened in their administrations. And that'll be part 3.